Hello, my friends, and welcome back to your favorite spooky history podcast, Strange Origins. If you are a long-time listener, I just want to take a minute to thank you for your support this past year. And if you're new, I want to say welcome. Each week, I dive into the history behind something that gives me the chills, or something that I've just always wanted to learn the history of. Most of the time, it's of the creepy variety. This week, I would like to give a special thanks to paranormalityradio.com, who found my podcast cool enough to let me join their network. Go check out their website and social media for suggestions of other podcasts to listen to if you're a junkie like me, or if you have your own supernatural podcast you would like to promote, go submit for membership. From my experiences so far, it's well worth it. With the opportunities I will be awarded with them, my hope is that I will be able to become self-sufficient with my writing and podcasting, whether that's with Strange Origins or any other podcast that comes out of this crazy brain of mine. Before I get into this week's stories, I'd like to ask a small favor of everyone that enjoys my work. Please subscribe wherever you're listening to get notifications of new episodes. And if at all possible, I would love it if you'd take a second to rate me on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. I would be extremely appreciative. If you don't have iTunes, I would love it if you simply just forwarded my show to a friend who likes weird stuff like we do. It helps me to get the word out about who I am and helps me in continuing to do what I love. And now, on to the show. If you're an American, which at least 60% of you are, according to my stats, you've probably heard your fair share of what people are calling contemporary American legends. Personally, I enjoy the classic stories that are told at sleepovers or teenage parties. You know, those ones that usually involve teenagers being stalked and leave you feeling scared to drive home at night. A great example of one of these types of stories is of the man with the hook for a hand who terrorized teenagers making out in their car in the middle of nowhere late one night. Or maybe you've heard of the story of Humans Can Lick Too, where a little girl believes her hand is licked by her dog underneath her bed, but is actually being licked by a serial killer in hiding. Lately, Slender Man has become a popular urban myth about a tall, gaunt man who terrorizes children in the woods. If you grew up in the 1960s, you probably heard about the babysitter and the man upstairs, where a young woman who is babysitting one night is taunted by phone calls by a mysterious man telling her to check on the children. One of the more grotesque contemporary tales I remember hearing, and which was also featured in the movie Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, was titled The Spider Bite. In that story, a young woman is bit by a spider on the face, only to have the bite swell up and pop open, revealing 1 million tiny spider babies inside. For years, that story made me just a tiny bit nervous whenever a new bug bite appeared on my body. It seems every generation has their scary stories they tell around a campfire, or under a blanket with a flashlight. But from my experience, the stories of black-eyed children seem different. It's difficult to find much information on this myth. A simple Google search doesn't really reveal a whole lot. Few people like me who decided to write what little they had heard on the topic. There's also not a lot of research or speculation that has been done. Information is pretty limited to eyewitness accounts who don't really have any way of explaining what happened to them, or any way of justifying their reactions. Black-eyed children, from what is written about them, are kids aged 6 to 16 who have pale skin and pitch black eyes, as is probably obvious from their name. They are known for hitchhiking or knocking on doors of homes asking to come inside. Occasionally, they have even been known to tap on windows at night. They usually travel in pairs, but sometimes knock on your door in groups bigger than that. In some cases, these children are said to wear outdated clothing, and in even rarer cases, they are said to have talon feet, much like that of a crow. They politely ask for permission to enter a residence or a car, feigning a need for shelter or a ride. If they are not given permission to enter a home, it's common for the people encountering them to notice that their eyes turn completely black. Occasionally, it's later noted that those who communicate with black-eyed kids felt hypnotized into doing what they asked of them, despite an overwhelming fight-or-flight response. The thing that weirds me out the most about stories of black-eyed children is that there doesn't seem to be a reason for the stories to even exist. In my experience, a story, especially a myth, has a reason for existence. It's passed down from family member to family member, from friend to friend, in order to share wisdom or a warning of some sort. With other American myths, the warning is not to trust strangers who call your house late at night, or not to go to secluded areas to make out with your boyfriend past midnight. But what could the lesson be with the myth of black-eyed children? Contemporary myths usually feature a villain that is known to be dangerous in reality, like serial killers or poisonous spiders. The story has a purpose for what they are doing, and the people who have been terrorized by them fit a certain demographic. Black-eyed children target everyone, and the reason for doing so is clouded in mystery. My question is, where did this story originate? Is it like most contemporary American myths that popped up somewhere in the last century, or do these children have a history beyond that? In 2013, the television show Monsters and Mysteries in America featured Brian Bethel on an episode to discuss his experience. In the spring of 1996, while working as a journalist in Abilene, Texas, Brian went out of his way across town to pay a bill one night. Alone in a parking lot in front of a movie theater, he was confronted by two boys, each around 12 years of age. Wearing black hoodies that covered their faces by shadow, Brian politely asked them if they needed anything. One of the boys replied that they wished to go to a movie. Mortal Kombat was playing that night, but that they had left their money back at their mom's house and asked for a ride there. Brian reported that the kid seemed a bit off. The one he was talking to seemed strange in his speech, like it had been written by an adult and memorized. Brian felt strange, like something deep in his brain was sounding off alarms. Though he wanted to leave immediately, his hand drifted to unlock the door, almost like he had been hypnotized to do so. When he pulled his hand back, the boy who he had been speaking to stated that they needed in his car, and they couldn't get in unless he told them they could. Looking back up at them, he noticed their black eyes, finally illuminated by the marquee of the movie theater. When he drove off, sensing danger if he stayed, he looked in his rearview mirror and noticed that no one was there. Later, he stated that he heard of a similar incident in Portland, Oregon, to someone who he had never talked about his experience with. Another story of an encounter came from a Marine stationed in North Carolina, according to liveabout.com. Living on the third floor of a group of buildings used to house Marines, a man was watching a movie when he heard a knock on his door. Assuming it was a roommate that was drunk and locked himself out, he opened the door, only to find a pair of small children. The first thing he noticed was that they had black eyes. Trying his best to ignore that, he asked what they were doing outside of his door at such a late hour. They replied saying that they were cold and that they wanted to come in and read, which he took as extremely strange, as I would too. Not a lot of kids are eager to read immediately upon entering a stranger's home. Not seeing anyone else around, he became frightened when one of the kids took a step forward, so he simply just shut the door. They kept knocking for about 5 minutes, then knocked on his window, and then finally left. When telling others about it, people simply just assumed he had been drinking, though that hadn't been the case. In one rare event, a woman let 2 black-eyed children into her home in Vermont, and met with even more strange consequences. She recalled that the children knocked on her door, a boy and a girl, who looked as if they needed shelter from the snow that was coming down hard outside. She noticed that they weren't dressed in anything warm like coats or gloves. The woman and her husband asked where their parents were, and the children replied, "They'll be here soon. Can we come in?" After they made the mistake of allowing them inside, the woman noticed that they simply just stared at the ground until they sat down on a couch in the same room as her husband. Something that the woman noticed inside her kitchen was that her cat, who was normally very friendly to strangers, hid underneath the kitchen table and was growling lightly. Returning to the living room, the woman handed them each some hot chocolate to warm them up from being outside without any warm clothing on. She remembered noticing that when they looked up, their eyes were completely black. Asking to go to the bathroom, the children went down the hall, and the woman noticed that her husband was dizzy and had gotten a nosebleed. That was when the power went out in the house. Going to the bathroom to get a tissue, she noticed that the children were just simply standing in the hallway, and told her then that their parents were there and that they needed to leave. They walked out, leaving the front door open, and got into a car with two men, who were each dressed in dark clothing. The woman noted that though the power came back on after the departure of the children, a few days later 3 of their cats went missing, and one died at the house, surrounded by a pool of its own blood. The strangest consequence, though, was that her husband, who continued to have dizzy spells and nosebleeds, was later diagnosed with an aggressive form of skin cancer. What was so strange about that was that it was the type of cancer caused by exposure to UV radiation, like that used in tanning beds, which her husband never used. Something that I wondered before beginning this episode is whether or not these children have a history beyond contemporary American myth. And I guess that depends on where in history you can find creatures that resemble black-eyed children, since there doesn't seem to be any record of events that are exactly the same from before the 1990s. Another facet of the myth that I didn't realize until researching this episode is that there's a twin version of black-eyed kids. Instead of black eyes, though, these children are noted for their eyes being completely white. For whatever reason, experiences with a white-eyed kid are more rare, and in most cases even more bizarre. Instead of having to ask for permission to enter, they can appear suddenly and out of nowhere inside your home. Rather than traveling in groups, they're unaccompanied loners. And while black-eyed kids range in their younger years, white-eyed kids appear more in the teenage range. Some believe that they are simply the matured version of a black-eyed kid, possessing the ability of mind control. White-eyed children seem more like they are the survivors, or the grown-up version of black-eyed kids. A theory that I've developed is that they are the counterbalance, kind of like how angels and demons oppose and also balance one another out. They have also been noted to be able to communicate telepathically, meaning that they don't speak out loud, only as a voice in one's head. Usually the people who experience encounters with white-eyed kids are so hypnotized by them that they don't question what is happening. They don't register that anything is strange until the white-eyed kids have left. Another note about white-eyed kids is that they, according to the stories, appear more to people aged 50 and older, and their purpose for communication is to foretell of a death. Unlike black-eyed kids, they are known to follow those that they have visited, stalking them for days or weeks after communicating with them by staring at them from across streets or through their windows. Of the few that there are, researchers of BECs believe that black-eyed children and white-eyed children may be the modern version of fairies, which makes some sense when you take into account that Irish folklore tells of changelings, which were fairy children left in the place of a stolen human child. Some believe that they are even a form of demon. Others believe that they are simply a form of demon. This story makes the most sense to me, as demons are also known for their pitch-black eyes and inability to pass into a home or a body without permission. Some believe that they are a modern version of a vampire, which is also understandable when you take into account that vampire children don't age past when they were changed. And based on the older, more popular mythology, they also cannot enter a property without permission. Of course, there are and will always be those people that assume that black-eyed kids are nothing more than aliens sent to Earth to gather information on humans. In the story I just relayed, where they were picked up by their quote-unquote parents, some think the men dressed in dark clothing are actually the infamous Men in Black. If you haven't seen the Will Smith movies, the Men in Black are thought to be government agents tasked with keeping the existence of aliens quiet. In some popular theories, the Men in Black are aliens themselves, disguised in the black business suits of the 50s and 60s. Some, and this is the creepiest theory in my opinion, believe that they are simply just children with sinister intentions. This is also a little harder to understand as it leaves more questions than answers, but it's still a logical theory, if you don't wish to believe in supernatural monsters. In some cases of black-eyed children encounters, it's been known for them to teleport, or at least just travel quickly. In one such case, a person driving away from one of the kids saw them twice again on the sidewalk, watching them drive past them in areas that it would be impossible to travel to on foot at a faster pace than a car. In other cases, they are just known to vanish, usually from the sight of security cameras. Sometimes cameras don't even detect them, and some people get the feeling after talking to them about not having a home to go to that they aren't exactly searching for a house to live in, but rather a body, much like a demon or spirit. Personally, I flip-flop back and forth between believing that the BECs are demons or vampires or something completely different. Something I want to note is that a majority of the encounter stories I read seemed fake, like someone writing fan fiction, but a handful of them did feel genuine. Those people weren't expecting to feel the hair on the back of their neck stand up from talking to a few children. Instead, they felt embarrassed even to admit that they were freaked out by a couple of kids. While this modern American myth may have had its debut in media in the 1990s, I can't help but wonder if there are, hidden deep in history, encounters with the same type of creature. Experiences that weren't abnormal enough to jot down on paper, or too perplexing to share with a friend. Maybe that's why these creatures use the camouflage of a human child. Did films and news reports of black-eyed children help to spread the myth, or did it simply just open up awareness to a new type of incident that was previously shrugged off as creepy but altogether inconsequential? Children asking for help isn't really that strange of a story, and the fact that someone would deny help to a bunch of kids isn't really something one would want to brag about. It's true that after a few reports on online sites like MSN, stories of BECs flooded into online forums. But was that because people truly had their own experiences and finally had an outlet? Or because there was just an audience that was willing to listen to anything, even made-up stories? A modern aspect of the contemporary myth is the idea that knowledge is a type of curse. When you know something, you're more likely to notice it, or as some people believe, it brings it into your life. You manifest it. Some think that even thinking about modern myths like the Bye-Bye Man or saying the names of Bloody Mary or the Candyman are sure to summon them. A rule with BECs is that it's the knowledge of the black-eyed children that brings them into your life. And with that, I will leave you to form your own reasoning of who the black-eyed children are, and what they want so badly when they knock on your door late at night. Thank you so much for joining me this episode. And as always, everyone, stay safe out there and remember to always keep it strange.